So hi everyone, thank you for joining me again for another frequently asked questions about beekeeping. This is Friday, March 22nd, and it is spring. Now, it's only spring on the calendar because outside, as you can see in the opening, we actually have snow falling right now. So we have high winds, it's in the low 30s, and we've just come out of a previous stretch there where we actually got some warm days. And I was all excited because the bees were out getting pollen, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. If you're new, welcome. Thank you for stopping by, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of these. And if you're returning, thank you, and I appreciate all of your comments. And as we go through the video, please feel free to write your questions down in the comment section below the video, because I'll be starting to make my list, of course, for frequently asked questions number 10. It's hard to believe we've done 9 of these episodes already, and I hope they're not running too long for you. And again, unlike some other parts of the country, we can't get outside to demonstrate things in the bee yard, although in future frequently asked questions response videos, I will be outside in the bee yard when it's nice and warm, and the bees will be flying, hopefully. And that leads me to something else. Some people that have started beekeeping now or been keeping bees for many years, there are problems with this time of year. And this is the time of year where a lot of beekeepers, new and old, become depressed about their bees. We just had a beekeeper breakfast this week, Beekeeping Association. And of course, they always go through and ask everyone who's lost their bees, how many did you lose? And I think they asked by percentage this time, 20%, 50%, 60%. Some people lost all of their bees. There were people that had, one individual had 20 hives. I believe he lost 19. Another fellow had 2 hives, lost them both. So it's 100% loss, you're out of bees. Nothing would be more depressing than to start your spring without honeybees. And if you've got just 1 or 2 hives and they died out, that's 100% loss. And some people, even with larger numbers, don't be discouraged. I know it's hard to follow that line of thought. Why wouldn't you be discouraged if even the experts at keeping bees are losing their colonies? Then what's the incentive for you to keep honeybees in the first place? Well, hopefully it's out of interest in the bees, that you want to understand them better. And of course, even longtime beekeepers are still trying out new things. We're paying attention to studies where I live, and we're in the northeastern United States, and in an area called the Snow Belt. I mention that all the time, and you can tell by the video that I showed at the opening. And this is a terrible area for keeping bees. And it's not because there are some areas that are even colder than we are that do better. And one of the reasons that it's a big problem here, and these are just my opinions and my observations through many years of keeping bees. My whole goal, starting right in spring, is to build them up and get them ready for the coming winter. It's kind of sad, but that's the truth of it. How do you house them? How do you feed them? What are their numbers? Do you treat? Do you not treat? Do you use insulated covers? Do you wrap your hives? Do you put straw bales next to them? Do you move them into a house? One of our beekeeping members, who is fairly new to beekeeping, put 3 colonies inside a shed this year. And he left the shed doors open and shared a little bit about that. 100% of those bees are alive. They're alive on Wednesday. Now we're back in a cold snap with snow and ice. And what I'm sharing with you is that if you're in an area that has these temperature extremes, these fluctuations where you get a day where it hits 50 or 55, and you get all excited, you go out there and you're sipping your coffee and you're looking at the bees and you're just so excited because they're bringing in pollen and they're so productive, and those hives made it. I personally got excited because I collected a swarm, a late season swarm, and I put them in a hive body, swarm for my own apiary, because I saw the branch that they went onto and collected them and housed them up. And of course, the Beekeeper Association president said, yeah, anybody who puts a swarm in late September or whatever, they're just doomed, so you're kind of wasting your time. And I thought, challenge accepted. And I put a special feeding shim in there. I put a rapid round feeder in there. I loaded them up really good in the fall, made sure they had lots of honey, and honey that they produced on their own. These were very productive bees. Their numbers skyrocketed. And I thought, yeah, you know, we're gonna win this. And I do look at it kind of, it's a competition. You're competing with the weather and the environment and all the challenges, including varroa, including small hive beetles, including all the other things that come and attack and work against your bees. Dearth, rainy season through what should be a nectar collecting time, pollen dampened by rain, all these things we're in competition with. So we're trying to get our bees through. So I thought if I can get this colony through, and this last warm-up that we had, that little colony, that late season swarm in a single deep, was making it. Well, they're not making it anymore. So I lost them. They were the ones that I had out in my, those are hazelnut trees, and I thought that's great because I set them off by themselves. They're going to do really well. I just want to encourage those of you who may have lost your bees this year. You're coming into spring, you're opening up your hives. Still don't open them. I have hives I haven't opened at all. And that's because we have weather like this. There's nothing to be gained by looking in there unless you think you're going to offer them more resources. I have hives that I know still have 50 pounds or more of honey on them. And there's very little activity. So you really don't know if they've made it yet. Wait for the warm-up. We're in spring, but still hold out because it's happened time and again. Colonies that we thought were absolutely doomed sprung to life and actually started foraging in the spring. So this is a time of stress. Days like today. It's snowing, it's blowing. You know, the birds, of course, are here to start nesting, and they can't nest yet because it's, you know, windy and snowy. So what I'm saying is new beekeepers are on equal footing with seasoned beekeepers that have been doing this for decades. And that's because we're facing the identical challenges. The information is out there. Hopefully you're learning stuff from videos like this one and from websites like mine or your Beekeepers Association. And it's frustrating because we all want to know, oh, all your bees made it, what did you do? All these bees made it and these bees failed. We had screen bottom boards. We had solemn bottom boards. Over here they made it, they had solemn bottom boards. The screen bottom boards over here failed and died out. So we're all looking for consistencies, and we're looking for methods of keeping bees that will kind of guarantee their success. But this is livestock. You have to look at it. These are not wild native bees. These are livestock managed under the Department of Agriculture, and we have to take steps to improve their chances, and there are going to be losses. And I don't know of any other livestock other than bees where you can have a 50-60% loss and still be in the bee business. Think of it, if it were cattle and you lost 60% of your cattle, it would be a huge thing. You'd probably be ruined. So beekeeping, you know, is for the hopeful, for people that are optimistic and continuing to work forward and continue to work with their bees. Because I look at it like this. In the past, I've lost huge numbers of my colonies. I've lost 6 out of 7. I've lost 8 out of 10. But then what I do is look at the bees that made it. That's the rainbow. That's the promise of the future, kind of, is that if these bees make it, you know, so my tiger colony, if they make it, and right now I have a ridiculous tiny colony of weaver bees that are in a single 8-frame deep. That's all they were in all through the summer because they didn't build up. And they were kind of miserable. They really weren't productive. And I just thought, oh, you know, they're doomed. And I put them in a flow hive too, the most expensive beehive I have. And I just thought, oh, it's just going to be a complete failure. Well, guess what? In fact, when we talk about pollen during this frequently asked question series here, you'll be seeing those bees in that flow hive too. Small colony, guaranteed not to make it. Nothing going on, did not insulate their hive. They're on an aluminum open grid bottom board. The vent in the back was wide open. We had 60 mile an hour, 50 mile an hour, 40 mile an hour windstorms when it was cold. And I honestly can't even tell you how they made it. I really can't. I mean, that's the irony of the whole thing is there's no set formula for honeybees. So they make it and surprise us, and then those that we're sure they're going to make it, we just know it. They don't. And you pull up a cluster of bees and they're dead 2 inches from full combs of honey. So much to learn, but that's the problem. And the magic of keeping bees is a lot of it, you know, we don't have answers for why they make it sometimes, and we don't have answers for why they don't make it. So when you walk up to beekeepers and they have the answers and they're just like, yeah, I know what to do. I know what the bees are going to do. No, you don't. We don't know what they're going to do. We can speculate, and experience helps because this has worked. It seemed to work, and this is where it's very important to keep a beekeeping log. Write down the hive numbers. Write down when you put that swarm in. Where did you get the swarm? How big was it? 3 pounds, 4 pounds? You know, the cluster size, make a reference. And keep logs, and you'll begin to see consistencies of success. But even beekeepers with 200 hives, 300 hives have lost 50% of their bees. That's huge. I mean, if my apiary, which has a max, I only went into winter with 7 hives, with 5 good colonies. The other 2 were very iffy. But 7, you know, so if they all died, that's a failure, you know. But I'm not out thousands of dollars. It's not my business. My business is completely different from bees. What I do with the bees is my product is information, observation, enjoyment of bees, and evaluating things that I think are going to work out well for them, and then sharing that with you on my YouTube channel. But as to why they make it, sometimes it's a mystery. As to why they fail, sometimes it's equally a mystery. And all I can say to you is, if this is your first year in beekeeping, don't quit. Don't be one of those people, you know, you try it one time, it didn't work out, you got so depressed and you got rid of your gear and you sold it all off and didn't want to keep bees. You will gain knowledge and ability year after year, and hopefully your chances will improve. My very first year of beekeeping, end of 2007, going into the winter, 2007, 2008, I did not strap down all my beehives, and I came home from school one day. I was teaching at the time. All the beehives were in the snow, face down, had blown off of their stands, the boxes all separated, and I lost all my hives right there. So that's depressing. You know, those are done. And then in the middle of a snowstorm. So I put all the hive boxes back and everything else, but they were doomed. But then the next spring, you just bought in all packaged bees and started from there and just continued on. And now I'm glad I did, because beekeeping is fascinating. You're never going to know it all. You're constantly learning. There's a constant adaptation of equipment, and there's always something to look forward to. The only downside for me is that no matter what the weather's doing, the first thing on my mind is, what are the bees doing? How are the bees going to handle this coming rain? This coming Sunday, we're going to have sunny and in the 50s. So if it's in the 50s and sunny, that really translates into 65 or 70 degrees. So I expect to see a lot of activity, and I'm going to make another video this coming Sunday too, and I'm going to talk about that here too. Okay, that's enough chit chat, I guess. You probably want me to answer these questions today. So again, if you have questions about anything, and if it's a piece of equipment or anything else, I'm going to put down in the video description the questions that I'm answering today. And then in the discussion section below the video, if you have further questions or you just want to contribute, you know, some information, feel free. And if you have a video link or something that you want to share here, I usually allow those as well. Okay? So yeah, write your stuff down and we'll start making a list for FAQ number 10 coming up. So the very first question, Francis Moore, and this is going to be a hard one to answer just because of the things that I've just described. Bees do what they do. Can you tell when they are making swarm cells? And then Francis says, I lost a hive. They swarm themselves to death. So that's actually sometimes a very common thing that happens. But rather than say, can you tell when they're making swarm cells, is really, can you tell if they're building up to swarm? And so we go back to, and again, remember that when we think we lock down the formula and we've kind of decoded the bees and we've figured out exactly what they're going to do, they prove us wrong. So we're talking about generalities and things that based on percentages tend to work out. So you really want to watch the buildup of the bees in the colony. Here's the thing. We're coming into spring right now and it happens all the time. Thank goodness for beekeeper associations. You really should join one if there's a group of beekeepers in your area, because that's regional activity. And this time of year, we're going to meet again next month. And I know that people are going to say, well, my bees swarmed, out of the blue. Because what they've done is they've got brood right now. They're building up right now. So the numbers are going to build. Now, when you went into fall and into winter, you probably condensed all your boxes down so that there was nothing but resources for the bees and then the brood comb for the bees. And so they had very little area to work with. And so that means in the spring, it's going to go the opposite way. As the numbers build, you need to be very tuned in to the bee colony, see what the numbers are, see what the hive population is, and you need to be prepared to expand your hive bodies. So that means adding honey supers, or you could do double deep boxes, whatever you decide to do for your area. But if the bees run out of space and their numbers are high and the nectar flow kicks in, expect them to swarm out. And it is very common, especially with some bee species, bee types, breeds. Different types of bees have different general behaviors. So some are known to swarm. I know that the weaver bees that I keep, the minute they're built up and their numbers are high, they swarm out. And then you can get a swarm within a week of that one, and then a swarm within 3 days of that one. And those subsequent swarms can happen, again, because the population is high, but they just continue to empty out the hives. So on the flip side of that, if they've all moved out, and you've got honey resources, but you've got a bunch of empty, non-productive space in the hive, I think it's time to condense that down a little bit to accommodate the new size of swarm. The other thing that we need to think about, why might the bees be, abandoning that hive? You might want to think about, okay, that was funny. That was a driveway sensor for a delivery from Man Lake. So a whole bunch of bee boxes and woodwork for the coming year. It's all coming up. We have a lot to talk about there too. So we have a lot of material to cover, so we're not going to run out of stuff, but I look forward to answering your questions. Now back to the swarming thing. So not so much the swarm cells, how to tell when those are being developed, other than direct observation. You can pull apart the colony and look at the brood and look at the edges of the frames, center of the frames, look for supersedure cells and things like that. So keeping the environment appealing for the bees, disease-free. Sometimes varroa, if there's a huge buildup, the bees are just evacuating that. And a colony that's been evacuated doesn't suffer the stresses. Now, this is all speculation. So, if there's a disease colony, the bees are going to naturally look for another place to live. But these bees that swarm constantly and swarm themselves to death, as Francis says here, they do. I've seen that before, where all you were left with is a little fist-sized cluster of bees. The good news is it's in my experience, they've never completely abandon a colony. They've just swarmed so much that the numbers have gone way down. But that means that for that remaining group, and this usually happens for me and has happened in the past late in the year. So that means you're going to have to boost their resources to get those through winter, and you may have an outstanding queen. The other thing is pay close attention going into fall. Make sure that's a fertile queen, that she's a laying queen, because she's going to make your winter bees, and those have to be the healthiest, most robust bees that you can get, because they have to survive, where I live anyway, those long winter months, and they have to come out in spring. So whatever bees are in that flow hive too that I have, they're super bees. I don't even know what to say about them. And so rather than, how to tell if they're making swarm cells, look at the environment they're living in, what the bees are doing inside. You can search for the swarm cells yourself, but the population and the resources in the environment can kick off swarming. So expand or contract the spaces, keep the environment suitable for the bees. I hope that helps. The next question I had from Sean Malloy, okay, and he said, show us more on the technique you use to render your wax. I would like to build one. So we're talking about, remember that I'm a small scale beekeeper, and also that because I draw, my honey from flow hives, the flow frames, we're not really collecting a lot of wax, but I do get wax from the brood boxes and from the honey supers that are not flow hives. So what I do is I run them through a solar wax melter. I was going to bring that in and show it to you today as part of this presentation, but I decided the solar wax melter and the process of it is, that's a standalone video. So hopefully, we're counting on the weather. Tomorrow it's only going to be in the 30s. Sunday it's supposed to be in the 50s. I'm going to do a solar wax melting demonstration for you on Sunday. So look for that video there. And I'll go over that in much better detail rather than spend a lot of time here with it on the table. I want to show you exactly what we do. And I think if we're in the 50s and sunny, we'll generate enough heat to melt the wax and actually do a demo. So watch for that on Sunday. Next, what pollen were the bees bringing in last week? So here's the thing, and this is what people always want to know in their areas. My bees are bringing in pollen, what's it coming from? And that's one of the exciting things about beekeeping though, is to go out in the environment, see what the bees are on, come back to the landing board of your hives, look at them and see those loaded bees. And while I'm talking about this, the video is showing of the bees coming in with heavy pollen and also showing the source right now. The earliest source that I've found, most people talk about trees, maple trees and things like that, as pollen sources for bees early in the year, but they were actually on skunk cabbage. And I did a whole video just about the skunk cabbage, but it was really exciting. I wanted to follow up that video and show that with you, share it with you today, that the honeybees, skunk cabbage is a wetland plant. It comes off these deep rhizomes, it grows up through the humus, and it is actually a warm-blooded plant. I know, that's weird. So it generates its own heat and that melts its way through snow and ice. So it actually germinates and exposes its flower before other plants can while it's still freezing cold. So what's cool is the interior of that plant, they create a little hot room. So I went out there with a thermal camera to see what it was doing. And it was 27, 28 degrees outside, and inside this little encapsulated part of the plant, sheltered from the weather, it was 43, 44, 45 degrees, and even hotter in some cases. So this plant generates heat, and the bees fly out, and the bees don't do very well in the cold. We know that. If it's below 50, they're potentially in jeopardy. So what the bees were doing, and this is what I failed at, I didn't get the video sequence of that. The bees were zipping into these little wetland skunk cabbage plants, and they're moving around and they're getting pollen all over them. And this pollen is so fine that it looks like somebody just dusted the bee, and it's pale yellow. So the minute they're flying to one, you try to get over there with your camera and you're slogging through the mud and everything, they're gone. So they weren't spending as much time in there as I thought they would. But the bee can actually go into that little encapsulated part of the skunk cabbage, and while they're collecting pollen, they're also generating heat. They're collecting heat from that environment so that their body can stay warm long enough to make it back to the landing board. So my fallback was to go to the landing board in the apiary and see them actually bringing the pollen in, and that's what you're seeing now. So my bees were getting stuff from the skunk cabbage. Now as other sources kick in, and the bees show their preferences. So when your bees are on like dandelions in the spring, that means there's nothing else more interesting to them. On the flip side of that, if they're not on the dandelions and there's dandelions everywhere, that means there's another source available that the bees prefer. So the bees are letting you know. And the best way to find out if they're bringing in pollen is just watch that landing board. And it is really funny to watch them come in because the bees are so loaded. Some of the pollen packs are just huge. And So, and I know that they're going to be hitting the wetland willow trees. We've talked about that before. I've planted willow trees myself, so I know that right now they're just pussy willow catkins that they haven't flowered, and we're gonna see those explode probably next month. So for now, skunk cabbage where I live, and if you've got wetlands near you, it's worth exploring because wetland plants tend to provide resources early. It's also providing resources for black bears. People have been seeing the bears already in the area. I'll be super happy if they stay away from my bird feeders and if they don't come near my beehives. But we're ready with the electric fence. So what the pollens are what they were bringing in last week for sure for me was skunk cabbage pollen. I don't know how that rates as far as nutrition goes for the bees, but they were bringing it in super loads. So the next one, Jeremy Lindsay. Okay. Told by a beekeeping club to quarantine all swarms and not to introduce near other colonies. Okay, now here's the thing. There are areas that actually regulate whether or not you can even collect a swarm. In the state where I live, the state of Pennsylvania, we're not prohibited from collecting swarms, but it is, I'm glad you brought that up because it is an opportunity to provide some pre-treatment. If you're collecting a swarm and you're going to hive that swarm, you know that they have not built up brood or anything else yet. So we don't really have a required quarantine period, and I have not ever quarantined swarms. So, and there's no requirement to do that. But I would say that if you're going to treat for varroa mites and things like that, so if you're doing oxalic vaporization and things like that, the minute you get your swarm hived, I would go ahead and hit them all. So you've collected your swarm, you've put them in your box, you move your box to where it's going to be, treat them, then leave them alone for a week or two. Don't go inspecting the hive or anything else. Leave them alone because you can cause them to swarm again. They're a little bit unstable. And after you've treated with oxalic vapor, then you can pull a frame of brood or something from one of your other colonies and stick that in the swarm box in your 8 frame or your 10 frame, whatever you put them in. And when they realize that there's brood in there, that works to anchor them and keep them in that colony, because once they accept the brood and the brood start hatching out right away, that firms up their location and helps keep them in place. Much better than just drawn out comb and things like that. So to quarantine them, I don't know what the quarantine period would be even, because if you have diseased bees, if they had foul brood or something like that, I don't know what the quarantine period would be or what the distance would have to be. So that's a puzzle to me, because they have to fly, they have to forage, they're going to interact with your bees, they're going to interact with other bees. So the quarantining thing I'm not sure about. I do know that if you're going to get old hive equipment, I never take other people's hive equipment. So that's much greater risk as far as beekeeping is concerned. If you're accepting old, like somebody had a die out and they gave up and they said, that's it, I'm through with bees, come and take my stuff. And if you take all their frame and their honey and their drawn comb and everything else thinking this is a great start, you don't really know why their bees died out. So I would think quarantine, treat, burn out, whatever hive equipment before you put that in your own. I'm a big fan of new stuff, not bringing in old stuff. But when it comes to the swarm itself, I've personally never quarantined them. Now, again, it might be a requirement where you live. So the other thing is, bringing in a swarm, you get a swarm call, and you go out of state, you're bringing in from out of state, you could be violating some regulations there. So make sure you understand interstate movement of bees. Even though, because like where I live, you can be in 3 different states in a very short amount of time. So we need to think about interstate regulation where you got the bees, but you know, it's the honor system because they're swarms and you're just boxing them up and bringing them home. But if you're going to treat, if you just want to treat something, you know, to make sure they're not bringing in varroa, oxalic vapor. That's what I would personally do. If somebody else has knowledge of quarantine requirements, please go ahead and put a link to those requirements down in the comments section below this video, because that would be an interesting thing to know. I've never had a requirement to quarantine something that was within the country, within the region where you live. transferring interstate and things like that. In fact, there are some states that have restricted when it comes to moving bees, and they have to have certificates with them. So the quarantine for swarms, I've never personally heard of. Okay. The next one is from Mandy Terry. Please explain the honeycomb harvest that you mentioned, chunk honey. So here's another thing. I'm sitting here at this table inside, nice and warm, while it's stormy, cold, and snowy outside. And, we're just describing things in theory at this point. But with my hives, again, because we know that I draw the honey off with flow hives, so I'm not extracting comb. So how do you get chunk honey and things like that? Chunk honey is drawn out comb that has nothing but honey in it, and you cut it out. And chunk honey, you take a jar before the honey gets poured into it, and you put that comb in there. Let's say that this was completely covered. This is capped, full of honey, and you put pieces of that inside there. And then you have chunk honey. Honeycomb full of honey, capped in there with honey poured around it. Now, how do I plan to get that? I plan to get that from my new feeder shims that I have. So I made these feeder shims this year. This happens to be an 8 frame. And this goes right on top of your honey super. So if you have a brood box, then we have a honey super, which is bee resources for winter. And then the next box up, I might put this as a feeder, but it's also an enclosed space. The bees can get through the bottom here unless I put a rapid round feeder in it. So when the bees have access to this space, then the inner cover goes on top of this, then the hive cover goes on top of that. The bees are going to run a bunch of random comb in here, and it's going to be, listen to, I'm speaking in absolutes, which you should never do with bees, but I'm going to go out on a limb. They are going to produce burr comb in here, and they're going to fill it with honey, and they're going to cap it. Then that gives you this great space that you can come in here with your hive tool, super clean, and you bring your empty jars with you, and you scrape out perfect chunks of capped honey in the comb, and you take that, and you take your empty jar, and you put that chunk in there, and you have a bunch of empty jars, and you put a bunch of different chunks full of honey in there. Honeycomb full of honey, capped. Then later you go and you fill that jar with the rest of the honey, and you have chunk honey. So this is my method. I just made these boxes this year, so I can control whether or not this is an upper entrance, queen excluder, vented, or wide open, or closed for winter. You can leave this on as a feeder resource, but when you don't need to feed them and the nectar flow is on, because you're not feeding, by the way, when you're collecting honey that you're going to keep. So once the nectar flow is on, you should stop feeding, because you don't just want to give your, bees a bunch of sugar water and let that be the primary source for the honey. We don't want that. But then when they build their comb up in here, that's when you can take that out. So that's what I'm doing. That's what's coming up this year. And if it works, I'm going to do a video showing you how I do that, because it's important for people that are keeping flow hives to know that you can still collect wax and honey together when you have a flow hive. It's not just about drawing off honey from the hive and not getting the benefits of wax and things. So, plus it's a feeder. So we're going to do that. Number 6. Do survivor honeybees produce less honey? Do others perform better? Okay, that's actually true based on the survivor line bees. First of all, what's a survivor bee? So when you're new to beekeeping, you kind of get a whole array of offers when it comes to what kind of queens to get, and the queen that you're going to get is going to be the colony. So, and there are old standards that people have been using for years, for generations, and they have definite traits. So, for example, when I was starting off, I was looking for untreated bees. I was looking for survivor bees, and survivor bees are those that make it without any treatment. And the most prominent family in the United States that's been working with those the longest has been, based on my research, there may be somebody else that I just have never heard of, but the Weaver family, and they're called bee weaver, and you can look them up, just Google bee weaver. And look at their genetic studies and look at the line of bees that they've developed. And what they have are bees that destroy varroa on their own, that are disease resistant, that are super hygienic. What does it mean, to be super hygienic? That means that they react to foreign materials in their hive differently and more strongly than some other bee types do. So for example, they're also what I call the Spartans of bees, because anything that's wrong, even a slight defect in another bee in the colony, gets immediately ejected. So, and sometimes that hygienic behavior goes overboard. They get so active at getting rid of every little malady within the hive that they'll be throwing out 50% of the brood. They're uncapping it, they're ripping them out while they're developing, so they're in the pupa state, and then just chucking them out the front of the hive, or they're flying away with them and letting those bodies drop. When I sit there and look at that, I can't see anything wrong with those bees that are coming out. Their wings are fine, the bodies look fully formed. It's a puzzle sometimes why they're doing what they do. So the trade-off has been, based on my observations and experience with these bees, and I've been doing survivor line bees for over 10 years, they do not produce as much honey and wax, and they may be great pollinators. But if you're looking for a line of bees that's going to produce maximum honey, they're not it yet. I mean, I'm sure the genetics are still, constantly, the adaptations are being worked out, the genetic strains are identified and replicated, and so they're continually improving these bees. But the trade-off in general, based on my personal experience, has been that hygienic survivor bees generally produce less than some of the other widely accepted types. For example, when I had Italian bees, they came through winter great, their numbers were awesome, they built comb like crazy, they collected honey like crazy. They also robbed all the other bees in the apiary that were weaker. So they were super robbing bees, beautiful golden light-colored bees. So Italians in the apiary just did crazy things, and that's where I had 4 and 5 boxes of supers high of bees that just kept taking honey on board. But they also required treatment to get through winter. They also were very easily overwhelmed by varroa. So when it comes to the types of bees, it's kind of a trade-off. Number one, identify why you want the bees. Number two, identify the favorable traits of those bees. Some of them are known to get through winter really well, some are not. Some are known to be a little hot, and when somebody talks about a hot hive, that means it's a type of bee that reacts defensively when the beekeeper's around or when animals walk by and things like that. So you look at the temperament of the bees. And the Weaver family has done a great job adjusting temperament. Years ago, I had some queens from them that generated some hives that were pretty hot. So that if you took honey off of them the traditional way and you pulled those frames and you uncapped and you extracted and spun that out, and even though you put that stuff right back, they were on patrol for a good hour or two after that. And on patrol, I mean they had guard bees circling the area 50 to 100 yards away, driving people off. So they were very upset. That is completely gone. So within the last 3 to 5 years, I haven't had a hot hive to deal with. So they've worked it out to where they're varroa resistant, they're hygienic, they're disease resistant. And this year I'm experimenting with oxalic vaporizers. But my expectation is that we're going to get very small numbers. But of course, the trade-off with these bees, you can get, if you're going in the honey business, see, I have to put this disclaimer out there. If I went into commercial beekeeping and I was counting on honey production and wax production, I have to be honest and say I would not probably be working with the survivor line bees if I were a commercial keeper, because I just have to be honest. The bottom line is going to drive what I'm doing. So if I'm in it for profit now and I want thousands of pounds of honey to market, some of these survivor line varroa resistant hygienic bees are not going to, they're going to be productive, but they're not going to compare to, for example, the Italians. I remember that. I had several tanks of 75-pound honey stores that I just didn't know what to do with. So I didn't want to do that because that's not what I was about. I wanted to learn about the bees. The honey was a byproduct, and if I didn't take it off, they were just producing it like crazy, and I couldn't keep expanding the boxes, so I had to take the honey off. or just have giant unmanageable hives, because when they went into winter and the cluster compacted, you'd have all these resources that the bees were not going to police because they were terrible at policing their area. So climate, area, oh, and I will say this year, somebody asked to give a heads up if I've got something new coming along. I don't know how many of you have heard of Saskatraz bees, Saskatraz bees. These things come from Saskatchewan, I think. Cold weather bees, survivor line, hygienic, untreated. I hadn't heard anything about this line of bees until a month ago. And very interesting results with those bees. So of course, even though I said last year my entire apiary is nothing but weaver bees, I have to backpedal on that now. Welcome to the world of beekeeping. And I do have to take a look at these Saskatraz. Saskatraz. I don't even know how to pronounce it. These new bees I'm going to look at. So I have ordered them. Super expensive. And if you've had them, and if you know more about them, let me know. Comment section down below, because these are going to be interesting this year too. So my mind is always open. I'm always learning new stuff. I'm always looking at the research, and I really go after the science first. I don't accept anecdotal stories about, you know, how awesome something is and how essential oils killed trachea mites and everything else. And another beekeeper on YouTube said that you could do oxalic vapor treatments, and that even treats capped brood. Okay, so you have to be careful. Look beyond what people are sharing with you and telling you is true, and always ask, you know, for scientific evidence of that, for some actual study, some quantifiable way to measure what those people are telling you is true with bees, because we want to cut through all of that and get to the reality of what's actually going to work. So those bees are interesting to me, and I'm going to learn more about the Saskatraz bees. Next one is Young and Song, number 7. How much do you sell your honey for? Okay, I have to put that disclaimer out there again and say, I'm not in this to sell honey, but we do end up with a lot of honey, so we kind of have to sell it. And my wife does most of that. And I'm going to start right off with, if you're giving away your honey as a present, this is my favorite thing. This is called a mooth jar, and it is 1 pound of pure honey. All the honey that we deal with is raw honey. Raw honey means that it has all the particulates in it. It's got the pollen, it's got little bits of wax, it's got little bits of propolis. Everything is in suspension in that honey, and the larger chunks will go to the top and you just scrape it off. This one looks like it doesn't have any of those particulates in it. We do not filter it. We do not heat the honey. It is as direct from hive to jar as you can get, because that's what we do. We take it straight from the hive, out the back, straight into the jars. So they're unfiltered. But if you're giving it away, 1 pound mooth jars, these are cool. These are an antique style. So I think good housewarming gift, something like that. Now, if we're selling it, I'll just give you the basics. This looks more like a sampler to me, and I have no clue. My wife sells the honey. And by the way, it's really flattering for those of you who write me and want to buy honey and want us to ship it and things like that. I just have to tell you that my wife already has a waiting list of people for honey locally. We're never going to market and ship it. We're not going to be selling it at Whole Foods or anything like that. Again, remember, my maximum apiary size is 10 hives. So we're not trying to produce a surplus and market honey. We're trying to learn about bees, study bees, share about bees. So a pint is $10, a quart is $20, and of course a gallon, a woman came and bought a whole gallon of honey, and that was $80. So the other thing is, sometimes we put these lids, this is my favorite thing. These are recap mason jar lids. So they're pour caps that have a seal on them. If you've seen my flow hive videos, when I'm extracting from the hive and I have the tube coming out, there's a 90-degree elbow and a tube going down, it goes right through this. So I use these caps when I'm harvesting honey to begin with. But then when we're selling a jar of honey, that's the large one, so that's too big. There's a wide mouth and a standard, so this is a standard lid. So these, if people want a pour top, we add these to it, but we also, I think, she charges $3 for this additional recap. But you can get these on Amazon too, and they're good for everything. But if your honey's in a jar that's got one of these on it, you can just pour it and cap it, and the cap stays tight so that you could even shake it upside down and it will not pop open on its own. So, and we only have one grade of honey. Although this year, because I told you it's going to work, my feeding shim is going to be my source for capped comb that is growing off the frame, and that is what I'm going to make chunk honey with, and I'm going to do a video just about that. So let's see, Pint, Quart, recap. That's it for today. So please let me know if you have questions. Thank you for watching, and I hope you get something out of it. Again, this is for beginning beekeepers. I'm glad to address your questions in the next one. We try to put one of these out every Friday, every Saturday at the latest, and we'll be discussing stuff. So if I don't get questions, I'm just going to share something new with you about bees every Friday or Saturday. Thanks for watching. Have a great time, and I hope that you are not in the snowy, frozen wasteland that we are in right now. Happy beekeeping.